Hello. Welcome to the project, Freedom and AI.
If you found your way to this content via Google or some other search engine, artificial intelligence played a role. Like in our everyday lives. In this episode, we will speak about AI and ethics.
We're living through the most remarkable times when it comes to our understanding of privacy, security, and freedoms. And this whole universe of activity is showing up in the technology sector. For so many years, organizations like Facebook and Twitter tried to stay out of the room of having to commit to what kind of company and what sort of culture they had when it came to the users on their platform. Mea culpa, they would cry. It's not our responsibility. We're just a company. We're just a platform. We're not journalistic. We just make freedom of speech available. And finally, that's changed. Finally, we've seen a situation where Twitter has had to decide where it stands on freedom of speech and hate speech. The same for Facebook and for Google with YouTube. And that's testament to this rising tide of comprehension and understandability, not just in business, but running through all of citizens and consumers, or whatever you want to call them, that it's not enough to stand by and watch our privacy and our security get invaded by big technology and by corporations and by governments. And it's a fascinating time to live through.
Artificial intelligence is more and more present in our lives today, often without us even realizing it. Never before could we access so many sources of information so quickly, regardless of its quality or authenticity. And the implications of this, particularly on our human rights, on our right to freedom of expression, our right to build opinions, our right to seek, receive, and impart information, are quite immeasurable.
We should be concerned by the fact that a lot of the data are in the hands of a few. And this is a problem because when you create a profile about someone, history have shown on this that Brexit and USA election, you can make a persona about someone and you can influence their voting choice, for example, which is one of the most democratic and important rights of a human being.
The combination of the data that we feed those services is quite large, and it's quite powerful because it was shown that a lot of researchers tried to predict, based on a specific certain amount of data that was fed, predict some other interest, whether it's sexual orientation, political inclination, based on a specific set of parameters that may look unconnected in the first on a first glance. But statistically, if you have enough of input data, you have patterns that can connect, saying, okay, if you like this specific type of music and you like that specific type of literature, and you're a young male living in a certain part of the world, you will most likely have this type of political views. So that can, and we saw that it has repercussions in the real world. So that aspect of digital and real life is not strictly divided. Digital stays in the world of ones and zeros. But it can also spill into the real world.
From state perspective, from the perspective of the government transparency, we need to know in what circumstances and under what conditions the states are deploying artificial intelligence in their operations. So this is not often just the companies do, but in collaboration of states. So how, and this applies to a broad variety of the state operations, from deployment of certain tools of controls of the border, in the surveillance of individuals, and so on. So first, it's like what the states are doing in their operations, what they are doing in collaboration of the companies when they have this corporate and state partnership, but also transparency of what corporations and companies are doing in their operations with the help of artificial intelligence.
So I think just focusing on ethics will not bring us to the protection and to the fulfillment of our rights online, but we really have to make sure that the human rights at the core of any policy and any regulation. But of course, there can be additional ethical thinking and considerations that can be useful and can also be very promotive for a pluralistic public debate and all these kind of issues. But it is not sufficient. It is one aspect, but human rights really need to be at the core.
We should note that AI is present in all our daily activities and has a huge impact on our behavior, both online and offline. And because our AI technologies are able to alter information flows and sometimes to subject individuals to behavioral experiments, the highest risk that I find out are those are undermining democracy and rule of law and threatening human rights.
In order for us to have democratization of data and of AI, we need more people to understand it. You know, a lot of the ideas are, oh, one day AI is going to come and they're going to, you know, they're going to be killer robots. It's going to be like Terminator, right? And that's really the biggest thing that I want to change here, because it's not that, you know, we don't need to be worried about general AI coming in at some point and ruining our lives, because we're already being impacted by AI every day. And it's the narrow AI that's pervasive in our lives. You know, I live in Brooklyn. I have 2 Alexas that listen to me, you know, and I'm telling them all the time, you know, what I need, what I want, right? And you know, they're giving me recommendations about what to buy, so they're shaping my life. You know, I use all the social platforms. They're shaping my life. If I want to go get a loan for from a bank for a house or for a car, you know, a lot of this stuff is already happening with algorithms. I get approved based on what the algorithm thinks I should be approved for.
Biometric data is data about any of us, that's to do with our faces, our bodies, the way we move, even things to do with our behaviors. So most people have heard of facial recognition. That's a type of biometric processing, but it can also, biometric processing can be done based on how we type. I've heard of it being done on how people smell, or how people distribute their weight when they sit on a chair. So there's many different ways of data about our identity and our bodies being processed and read. And often it uses artificial intelligence processes to make predictions or decisions about who we are or who we aren't, based on our biometric data.
I think a lot of us are used that there are cameras everywhere. The difference is now that with computer vision, which is part of AI, it actually starts recognizing patterns. So it can do a lot more than normal cameras can. So where in the past a person would go through the videotape, now it's instantly you can be recognized, and it can be used for crowd surveillance. Which again can be right for the right reasons to make things safer, but it can also be used to pick out people who are being profiled, and access isn't granted to certain people because someone doesn't like them.
I think that most people would be surprised to find out the extent of the biometric surveillance networks in Europe. I think it sounds like quite a science fiction thing sometimes. People think, oh, that wouldn't be happening, or well, it is. If it is happening, it must be legal, because of course, why would our governments ever do something that's not legal? But actually, what we're finding is that right now, the way that the laws in the EU have been implemented means there's a bit of a grey area that we're seeing governments exploit this legal grey area to bring in surveillance, biometric surveillance in so many places that we pass by every day.
AI impact our human rights through fake images and videos generated by AI, known as deepfakes. And these deepfakes are, in some cases, used to compromise individuals, namely public figures, and therefore affect their right to dignity and security of purpose. And just to put things in perspective, in the last couple of years, precisely in 2020, we have seen more than 15,000 deepfakes circulating on the internet. So it is rather serious.
So I think it's really something by now we know that there are a few powerful actors who influence all these different aspects, have all these different functions, and their own profit-oriented nature impacts all these functions, including which information who sees. And that matters, and it's relevant for being informed as a society, as individuals, for being able to have a public pluralistic debate. And I think here we really have to take a regulatory approach, because self-regulation cannot sufficiently protect our human rights in this really broad and complex aspect. So we need to have clear rules about who is allowed to do what combined with which. If so, which safeguards do they need to provide? And here again, like human rights impact assessments are an important tool to assess how all these different functions and policies and practices are involved, their impact on human rights. And then as a next step, once these risks are identified, there can be very specific mitigation measures for certain aspects, and then clear bans or other responses for those that pose too high risks to human rights.
When we talk about ethics, I immediately think of self-regulation. And while I would say it's important that there are self-regulatory measures in place by platforms, and while it's important that ethical standards are adhered to, it's by no means sufficient in terms of platforms making sure that they are respectful to our human rights when they are engaging in the use of artificial intelligence and arbitrating content online. And the reason I mention this is because we're not on day one of this issue, right? We have been debating and monitoring closely the practices that take place, particularly in the industry in terms of self-regulation. There are some efforts, whether it be internal codes of practices or observatory bodies that are sort of external to these platforms, but without concrete regulation, I don't think we will find a solution. And this is not to say that the states should necessarily be responsible for moderating the content of our speech online either. We know and we have seen that this can be very problematic as well. But we need to ensure there are really independent regulators that have the mandate to ensure that our human rights are respected when we engage online.
There are some decisions which are so important or which are so difficult that AI should never take them. The question of whether AI should be banned from certain decisions. One of the most prominent ones of these is in warfare. So a lot of people say that there should never be so-called killer robots or autonomous weapons because the life or death decision is just too important for AI to take. Whereas other people say, actually, if the AI is better than a human at distinguishing between combatants and civilians, and if the AI could save more lives, then maybe we should use the AI instead. So there are no easy answers to either of these sets of questions. How should AI take decisions? And on the other hand, are there any decisions that AI should never take?
Algorithms in the end are tools, and they are tools that are used by people. And we should never forget that whatever an algorithm is doing, there is a human being, or there are many human beings who programmed it. There are human beings who decided what the algorithm is supposed to do. And there are all the human beings who contributed to the data that trained the algorithm.
As AI becomes more central to our lived experience, it becomes one of the focal points for evaluating human rights, because the decisions made about us, whether we're hired, whether we're arrested, what our credit can be, where we get to live, where we can be educated, these decisions impact the most fundamental rights we have. And currently, we don't have the legal infrastructure to effectively regulate the AI systems that are making these choices about us. And we don't have the legal infrastructure to determine how we can take these artificial decisions and really subject them to human scrutiny. to make sure that the people who use these systems are accountable, and to make sure that we're not automating bias and discrimination.
In the next episode, we will speak about AI, regulation and protection. In the meantime, check our website, www.freedomanai.com.